What's up, Green Bay Packers fans? Welcome back, and as always, thank you for joining me. My name's Paul Brettel. Today we're going to discuss the Packers' performance against the Vikings and what was another slow start by the Green Bay Packers offense. Before we dive into all that, you know what to do. Hit like on the video, hit subscribe on the YouTube channel. I do greatly appreciate it. You can follow me on Twitter at Paul_Brettel. Find all my work, including the article version of what we're diving into here today over at ESPNLacrosse.com. And my Wisconsin sports radio fans, Packers, Brewers, Bucks, Badgers, whatever you might need, 5 days a week. Download the 105.5 ESPN Lacrosse app. You can find me on Sports Lead Monday through Friday, 3 to 6, multiple days per week. Like I said, we're going to discuss the Packers' slow start on offense, specifically the disjointed passing game that we saw. And again, this isn't the first time we've unfortunately seen this season from the Packers. They're now 0-5 against the NFC's best teams, losing twice to Detroit, twice to Minnesota, and then week 1 to the Philadelphia Eagles. And while the final score, as Green Bay has also done in the past, is close, right? They only lost by 2 points. They had an opportunity late to get a third down stop, to give their offense the ball back, to potentially put together a game-winning drive. And they were unable to do so. But that final possession, final few possessions, that final score, obviously don't tell the whole story of how this game unfolded and the issues that Green Bay ran into. They dug themselves an early hole, and once again, it proved to be too much to overcome. And like I said, this is an uncharted territory against the Lions and against the Vikings over those 4 games. And hat tip to Andy Herman for doing the digging on these numbers. But combined, the deficits that the Packers faced at various points in those games totaled 89 points for their opponent to just 13 for Green Bay. They're not just falling behind by a touchdown, 10 points in these games. They are falling behind by 2 touchdowns, sometimes 3 touchdowns in these games against the NFC's top teams. And again, valiant effort in coming back and continuing to fight. That matters. That means something. But as Matt LaFleur said, and as we all know, you cannot start that way against teams of this caliber. It's just, as we've seen in their record against these teams, way too much to overcome. As expected for the run game, it was tough sledding, right? I think Josh Jacobs' longest run was 13 yards, but as an offense, Green Bay averaged 4.3 yards per rush. And again, this is against a Vikings defense that has been one of the best in football at defending the run, giving up just 3.8 yards per rush this season. It was always going to be tough sledding on the ground, but the Packers did a good job of churning out productive yards, right? Giving themselves an opportunity to be in a manageable down in distance on second and third to stay ahead of the sticks. The issue, however, when you fall behind quickly, when you fall behind early by multiple scores, you can't exactly lean into the run game, right? You get out of your offensive game plan. You start to become more pass heavy, and that's really what we saw from this team. Again, they didn't have the opportunity as they have in recent weeks, where the run game has been a catalyst, has been an element that they can lean on. That just wasn't the case against the Vikings because, again, fell behind early, didn't necessarily have that opportunity, especially into the second half, to really lean into that run game component. The issue, as we saw, lied with the passing game, right? And again, valiant effort to be able to come back to find some success in that fourth quarter to make it a close game. Got some help from the Vikings with a Darnold interception, 2 missed field goals, and a little bit of soft coverage at the end as the Vikings were protecting against the big play, trying to make the Packers plot their way down the football field. Who knows? Maybe if these teams meet again in the playoffs, that success in the fourth quarter by the Packers offense can be a catalyst towards what hopefully is an improved performance if they meet again. But for the time being, again, too big of a hole early on for them to overcome. Jordan Love finished the game 19 of 30, 185 passing yards, averaging 6.2 yards per attempt. And those numbers on their own, again, not great by any means, but even that doesn't tell the whole story of the issues that the Packers had in the passing game. Through 3 quarters of the game, Jordan Love was 10 of 18 passing, 64 yards at 3.6 yards per attempt. For some context around that 3.6 figure, coming into Week 17, Bryce Young, Carolina Panthers quarterback, ranked 35th in the NFL in yards per pass attempt at 6.1. Love was averaging 3.6. There were 4 Minnesota Vikings receivers, or pass catchers, including Hockenson at tight end, who had more receiving yards through 3 quarters than Jordan Love had passing yards through 3 quarters. On passes of 10 or more air yards, and these numbers are from ESPN, Love was 4 of 10 passing, 77 yards, with 40% of those throws being off targets, according to ESPN. So again, those figures, even though the overall numbers, again, certainly aren't great, those figures are a more accurate representation of what we saw from this passing game for really the majority of the game. And it was obviously a very out of characteristic performance from Love, from the passing offense, especially given their play in recent weeks. I mean, this is a group that had been trending in the right direction from weeks 13 through 16. That's last four games leading up to this one. Love was completing 67% of his throws at almost 9 yards per attempt, 6 touchdowns to no interceptions. Again, the offense was seemingly starting to find its groove. Now, they were still searching for that full 4-quarter, 60-minute performance, right? That consistency to go out and put together a complete game. Even with the improved play that we had seen in recent weeks, that was still something that this group had been chasing. But even with the, again, success that they've had as of late, this disjointed performance as a categorized against we saw at the Vikings started last week against the Saints. I think it was overshadowed a little bit, again, because the Packers won, 34-0, as they cruised to a pretty easy victory, put up that many points. But in that second half, the passing game, again, was struggling to find a rhythm, seemed just out of sync, just off, right? And again, I think that was masked by what the outcome of the game was. But that play parlayed into the performance we saw on Sunday against Minnesota, and of course against a team of that caliber, a defense of that caliber, a defense that is that aggressive. Those issues that were there were magnified. Those issues were taken advantage of by the Minnesota Vikings defense. And again, this is we talked about in the video leading up to the game, this is a very, very blitz-heavy Vikings defense that the Packers were up against. And they do an outstanding job, in part because of their blitzes, but they also have a very good defensive front of generating pressure on the quarterback. And as the game went on, especially as we got into that second half, that pressure started to become an issue for the Packers, right? At that point, you're down multiple scores. You're becoming predictable. You're becoming pass heavy. You're becoming one-dimensional. You're playing into the strength. You're playing into the teeth of what this Vikings defense wants to do. You're predictable. They know you're going to pass the ball. They crank up their aggressiveness. That's already a very aggressive unit. They're pinning their ears back. They're getting after the quarterback. I mean, that's what they want to do. And when you're routinely passing the ball, pass, because you don't have the ability to lean on the run game because you're trying to play catch up, that just magnifies what this defense already does well and gives an already good defense the advantage in those situations. Now, having said that, as we look through the issues that the passing game experienced in this, I'm not going to put the offensive line and their pass protection abilities at the top of the list. For me, that's not the big thing in this game. I mean, according to Pro Football Focus's early metrics, Love was still pressured on fewer than 30% of his dropbacks. Relatively speaking, compared to the rest of the NFL, what we see on a weekly basis, that isn't a high pressure rate that he was having to navigate. And even when he was blitzed, he handled it well. He completed 62% of his throws, again, according to Pro Football Focus's early metrics. This wasn't like the Detroit game, right? Like if you recall that the Detroit game, that first half, before the passing game really picked things up in the second half, Love was under constant duress, right? We're watching those first few drives. He has no time. I didn't think that this game was unfolding, especially in that first half in that capacity. But like I said, as things went on, as we got deeper into the game, as the Packers became more one-dimensional, that pass rush component, the Vikings' ability to blitz, to generate pressure, became a bigger factor. But in no way do I think that was the culprit behind the struggles that the passing game faced against Minnesota. Now, what was the big issue for the Green Bay Packers passing game was the lack of rhythm, the lack of cohesiveness. And again, I'm going to go back to this word again, disjointed. It was off. It was out of sync, out of rhythm. Timing wasn't there. And again, with the Vikings and their ability to blitz, they also do a good job on the back end of disguising coverages, which is a part of this equation and part of the issues that the Packers ran into. But I think the bigger thing, and Matt LaFleur talked about this after the game, the Vikings went very, very man-heavy in their coverage approach against the Green Bay Packers. And LaFleur said that this is something that they had put on tape, Minnesota, a couple weeks ago, I believe is what he said. But he didn't think that was how the Vikings were going to attack Green Bay in this game. So when the Packers got those looks, and according to NFL Next Gen stats, the Vikings played man coverage on 47% of their defensive snaps. When the Packers got those looks, wasn't what they were expecting, wasn't what they had prepared for during the week. And so when you see things just being off, the off-target throws, Matt LaFleur talked about on halftime on the TV broadcast that the receivers just weren't quite in the right places. The details were off. If you think about if you're the wide receiver and you're running your route and expecting the other receivers, pass catchers on your side of the ball to be in certain spots given the coverage that you're facing, right? But then you see a completely different coverage, right? So how you respond to that in the moment, I mean, that can throw off the timing, that can put you in a different place. And again, all it takes is a yard or two, right, from where your route breaks in, from where you're supposed to be, to throw off the timing of a play. It doesn't have to be this massive altering of where you're supposed to be on the football field. It just takes that split second of being off that throws off the entire play, changes what Love's read is, where he has to go in his progression, and everything just kind of breaks down from there. So when you learn that aspect of it after the game, you can see why, again, there were those issues in the passing game where everything just didn't quite mesh, right? It didn't quite come together for Green Bay. They're getting different looks. They're getting looks that they weren't expecting. So there's that hesitation. As we just mentioned, the receivers and where they're supposed to be, the timing of everything gets thrown off. And that was really the source of the issues that we saw from this Packers passing game. And not having Christian Watson, again, I'm not saying that the passing game would have looked night and day different through three quarters if Christian Watson was out there, but he certainly would have helped. He is their best receiver when it comes to winning those man coverage routes, that size, that speed element that he brings to the table. So that was a part of the equation. And then this is a Packers offense that thrives off of generating big passing plays, especially since the bye week, and Christian Watson's obviously been a big part of this. They've been generating those big, 20, sometimes 30-yard plays once or twice on a weekly basis, really over the last 4, 5, 6 weeks. But again, Matt LaFleur said afterwards, that's something that, again, this Vikings defense does a really, really good job of, is taking away those downfield pass attempts. So what do you have to do instead? You got to rely on the underneath stuff. So the Vikings forced this Packers offense that was really, again, out of rhythm, disjointed, to have to string together long drives, right? Because they weren't going to give up the 20, 30-yard plays. So the Packers were going to have to go the underneath routes, take their 8 yards, take their 10 yards, take their 9 yards, 12 yards, and plot their way down the football field. But that was a tall task, again, for a team that wasn't operating efficiently, for a team that was struggling to string together receptions for a large portion of the game. So what happens? It puts you in long down and distance situations. You can't lean on the run game. You're struggling to complete passes in the passing game. So now you're in 2nd and 10. Now you're in 3rd and 10 situations. And again, we talked about how playing from behind, being behind, just plays into the Vikings defense. So does being in those 2nd and 3rd long down and distance situations. Defense can pin its ears back. Secondary has the advantage from a coverage standpoint. It was just playing into what this Vikings team does so well. And then that just magnified what we were seeing from the Packers' perspective, the issues. And it was like a vicious cycle, right? That just kept repeating itself over and over and over again for 3 quarters. You don't pick up any significant yards on first down. You're in 2nd and 3rd and long. The defense blitzes, they send pressure, they get after the quarterback, incomplete passes, you punt, cycle starts all over again. That's what a lot of this game was, and not helping things for the Packers were penalties. I think they were penalized 7 times in the game. There was a special teams penalty, but a lot of those were on offense, and it was reminiscent of the issues that we saw from this group through the first half of the season, right? The pre-snap penalties, holding penalties, and again, that puts the offense behind the sticks, puts the offense in these obvious, predictable passing situations where the defense has the advantage. There's more of a burden on the passing game that's already struggling. So again, that vicious cycle was back at work for the Packers, and the end result was off-target throws from Jordan Love. Again, we talked about on his 10 pass attempts of at least 10 yards through the air, that 40% of them were off target, according to ESPN. There were some drop passes, and as we mentioned, the timing, the details. As Matt LaFleur said, they were just off. And again, I think a lot of that is attributed to the Packers, from the sounds of it, being caught off guard by how the Vikings defended them. There's a hesitation, the timing, the rhythm, everything gets thrown off at that point. And you want to see this Packers offense adjust more quickly. And I know this is something we talked about after the Detroit game, right? Because through that first half, there was some early success in the run game, but Detroit pivoted, started loading the box, and they really took Josh Jacobs away. And it took until the second half for the Packers to really lean into the passing game against Detroit, which is what the Lions were daring them to do. They were saying, throw the ball. We want you to throw the ball. We are not going to let you run the ball. But it took until that third quarter to really, again, lean into that element. And again, we've talked about this previously, but there's, as Matt LaFleur said, there's key moments throughout the game, right? There's 3, 4, 5 plays that a lot of times decide the outcome. But you don't know when they're going to appear. It's not only in crunch time. It's not only within the 5 minutes of the fourth quarter. It could be in the second quarter. Can you get that fourth down stop at the goal line to keep the team out of the end zone? So consistency is obviously a key to being effective in those situations, because again, you don't know when they're gonna pop up, when those moments are gonna happen throughout the game. And so struggling to adjust quickly, right? And that could be just a quarter, that could be 2-3 possessions, struggling to make those adjustments on the fly, recognize that they're doing something differently, and then have a counter to it to be able to attack it. It's the inability to do that quickly enough that come January, come the playoffs, is going to send you home, right? If, like we talked about during the Seattle game, there were, as good as the offense had looked for the most part, there were those 4 possessions in the second half where the Packers were unable to move the ball. The 4 possessions took a total of 15 plays. Against a Vikings team, against a Lions team, Philadelphia, I mean, that could be 2 scores for those opposing offenses. So again, the ability to adjust, and not just adjust, but adjust quickly, right? That's the key element right here. And again, that's something that just didn't quite happen for this Packers team, who obviously, and as they talked about afterwards, got different looks than what they were expecting. Now, with those struggles on offense, there is a lack of complementary football for the defense, right? And the defense, they had their own issues. Wasn't a perfect game by any means. They struggled to generate consistent pressure on Sam Darnold. But again, not helping things was the lack of complementary football from the offensive side of the ball, with the offense struggling to move the ball, struggling to pick up first down, struggling to sustain drives. It means more possessions for the Vikings. The Vikings finished the game holding the ball 11 more minutes than what the Packers offense did. There was one point, again, going into that fourth quarter before the Packers started to pick things up, where the Vikings offense had run, I believe it was somewhere between 15 to 20 more plays than what the Packers offense had. I mean, that is a massive discrepancy considering who the opponent is, right? The Vikings, one of the best teams in the NFC, a very, very high-powered offense with Sam Darnold, Justin Jefferson, Jordan Addison, TJ Hockenson. Like, that is putting a lot of stress on on the defensive side of the ball, who now has to be out there for those additional possessions, who now has to defend those playmakers for an extra 15 to 20 plays at one point in the game. Again, that's a lot. That's asking a lot of just about any defense. And again, not to excuse the play on the defensive side of the ball for Green Bay. Obviously, areas that they have to clean up. They gave up 27 points. Could have been 33 if it wasn't for those missed field goals. So again, areas where they have to get better. But the offense's inability to stay on the field for a large portion of the game did not help whatsoever. Now, the big thing for the Packers moving forward, how do they get that signature win? And it's going to have to come in the postseason if it's going to have to come in all. Only one game left. It's against the Chicago Bears. Packers, like I said, are 0-5 against the NFC's top 3 teams. There's still belief in that Packers locker room that they can go out and beat any of these teams, that they can hang with any of these teams. And in that locker room, they need to have that feeling, right? You want the team to have that feeling, that belief that they can go out there and win any game. That has to be a true belief, in their minds and their hearts, that they can go out and do that. However, from the outside perspective, we need to see that, right? And it's just these little things throughout the game that just add up, that snowball, that end up being too much for this team to overcome against these good teams, right? It's the margin for winning and losing in the NFL is so razor thin that these little miscues that add up on each possession, all of a sudden you find yourself in a 2-3 score deficit. And again, valiant effort coming back, but against teams of this caliber, just too much to overcome. If you made it this far in the video, I do appreciate it. You might as well hit like, you might as well hit subscribe on the channel. Thank you for tuning in. Follow me on Twitter at Paul_Brettel. Find all my work over at ESPNLacrosse.com. Download 1055 ESPN Lacrosse app. Until next time, friends, take care.